Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into a couple of very interesting articles about China's space activities and how the US is reacting. Now, before we get into it, let's clear something up. Space is getting a little crowded, and everyone's trying to figure out how to maneuver up there. But is China really escalating space warfare? Or are they just reacting in turn to what the Americans are doing in terms of space warfare? Let's break it down. First up, we've got a report from the South China Morning Post about Chinese satellites engaging in what has been labeled dogfighting in space. Sounds pretty dramatic, right? General Michael Guetlein of the US Space Force recently said that the US has observed 5 Chinese satellites maneuvering in and around each other in a controlled and synchronized way. A dogfight usually refers to close-range aerial combat between fighter jets involving complex maneuvers. But according to the report, in space, it is far more difficult and slower for a spacecraft to maneuver, and the lack of atmosphere and friction also makes it more costly as the spacecraft has to expel its own mass to generate thrust. I'm not sure if I totally understand that, but I'm sure that the writer knows more than I do about space physics. The article continues, "This is the first time multiple Chinese satellites have been observed carrying out synchronized movements, though China has carried out many rendezvous proximity operations where spacecraft move close to each other and interact in space." China's Shijian-6 group of satellites, which the US Space Force was referring to, was launched in December 2021 to conduct research and for validation of new technologies, while the Shiyan 24C satellites, also mentioned by the Americans, were launched 2 years later for space experiments, according to official Chinese media. So what's actually happening? Well, my take, and this is my own personal view, is that China has been launching satellites for research and technology experiments, and some of these satellites are capable of moving in close proximity to each other. This isn't new. Many nations, including the US, conduct similar tests. But because these particular satellites are moving in a way that looks like coordinated training, the US Space Force sees this as preparation for future conflict. Whereas in reality, that's not necessarily the case. If you are enjoying this, please consider shouting me a coffee using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Thank you to all Patreon supporters. Of course, this wouldn't be the first time the US has sounded the alarm about China's space program. The idea that China's satellites could potentially fight against US space assets makes military officials nervous. But let's be real, China isn't exactly the first to do this. The US has long been the established player in space and the first mover in terms of the weaponization of space. And it makes sense that the other nations would want to catch up or react to this in some way. And let's not forget, the US Space Force itself has been pushing for expanded space control capabilities, meaning the ability to disrupt or even destroy adversary satellites in orbit. So, if the US is preparing for this kind of warfare, why wouldn't China be testing its own capabilities? There is historical precedent for military expansion into space. During the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union explored various space-based military technologies, including anti-satellite weapons. Today, the US Space Force has made space control, a term referring to the ability to disrupt, degrade, or destroy adversary systems, a core part of its mission. The recognition that space is a contested domain has led to increased militarization by most of the major spacefaring nations, and in particular, the United States. If China is doing anything at all, it would only be responding to the Americans. Which brings us to our second article. This one's about how US budget cuts might actually be making it harder for the Space Force to keep an eye on China. According to the article, Pentagon hiring freezes and staff reductions are affecting teams responsible for tracking China's space activity, including China's expanding satellite network. Now this is interesting. On the one hand, US officials are raising alarms about China's space maneuvers. On the other hand, they are saying that they don't have enough staff to properly monitor them. That raises a question. How much of this is actual concern, and just how much is about securing more funding? After all, the US military budget is the largest in the world, and every branch, including the Space Force, wants to make sure they get their slice of the pie. The victim, of course, is US taxpayer and everyday Americans. China, for its part, has been building up its own space surveillance network, kind of a counterpart to the US space surveillance network. And with thousands of new satellites planned, it's clear that they're not sitting back while the US dominates space. But again, is this really aggression? Or is it just China making sure it doesn't fall behind? Let's not forget that private companies like SpaceX are also major players here. Elon Musk's Starlink project has put thousands of satellites in orbit, and China is responding with its own mega constellation. If we're going to call China's space expansion a military threat, shouldn't we be saying the same thing about the US launching thousands of its own satellites? At the end of the day, this is all about perspective. From China's point of view, they're just doing what the US has already been doing for years. Is China actually escalating things? Or are they just making sure that they can hold their own in a world where the Americans are making space the next big battlefield? And while the US is warning about potential threats, they're also admitting that they may not have the resources to monitor these threats properly. Space is only going to become more competitive, but whether that leads to conflict or a new kind of balance remains to be seen. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are these moves by China worrying, or just part of the new normal started by America? See you next time.